Good morning. All right. Welcome to the closing keynote on Wednesday morning. Announcing their new book, Rick Hess and Bror Saxberg have written Learning by Design, Breakthrough Leadership in the Digital Age. They will have a book signing following the keynote over in the my left-hand corner of the room. And please feel free to submit questions via Twitter, iNACOL 13. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. Rick Hess is well known across the United States for his work in education and education reform. He's an educator, political scientist, and author. I would say a very productive author. Rick Hess studies K-12 and higher education issues. His books include Cage-Busting Leadership. We love that, right? The same thing over and over. We don't like that so much, right? Education Unbound, Common Sense School Reform, Revolution at the Margins, and Spinning Wheels. He has edited widely cited volumes on education philanthropy, school costs and productivity, the impact of education research, and No Child Left Behind. Hess serves as an executive editor of Education Next, as lead faculty member for the Rice Education Entrepreneurship Program, and on review boards for the Brod Prize in Urban Education and the Brod Prize for Public Charter Schools. A former high school social studies teacher, he has taught at the University of Virginia, the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Rice University, and Harvard University. He holds an MA and a PhD in government, as well as a master's in education and teaching and curriculum from Harvard University. Bror Saxberg is the Chief Learning Officer for Kaplan, a subsidiary of the Washington Post Company, and a leading global provider of educational services offering post-secondary education, test preparation, professional training, and K-12 programs. Saxberg is responsible for the research and development of innovative learning strategies, technologies, and products across Kaplan's full range of educational service offerings. He also oversees future developments and adoptions of innovative learning technologies and maintains consistent academic standards for Kaplan's products and courses. I could go and tell you a story of the first time that I met Bror over 10 years ago. I have never heard anybody talk about the connection between cognitive science, research, the way kids learn, in a way that translates into the kind of work that happens in online learning and transforming to student-centered learning. And I know that Bror is not afraid of going to school. He has more degrees than just about anybody I've ever run across. He has a bachelor's in mathematics, a bachelor's in science and electrical engineering from the University of Washington. As a Rhodes Scholar, he received a master's in mathematics from Oxford University and also received his PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT in 1989, but that wasn't enough. He went to get his MD from Harvard Medical School. So, here's someone that knows a lot about the way not only the brain works, but how all of these things fit together. And we are so honored to have Rick and Bror here with us today. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Hey, thank you, Susan, for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. If you ever want to have a really humbling writing experience, write with Bror Saxberg. It's just scary.
I was scared. Writing with you, you've written so many books.
Yeah. Well, it's like my usual response to Susan pointing out my productivity. When you don't let quality concerns get in the way, anything is possible. Bror and I are going to, we want to do is talk with you guys today about the new book. We think it actually works beautifully in light of what it sounds like the series of conversations have been unfolding this week. We think it's a terrific note to close on, because folks in this room understand that it's not about the technology, it's about what we do with it. They understand that there is a pretty sordid history of actually using technology to transform education in America. And Bror and I, in writing this book, what we're really hoping is to offer some real illumination, a path forward. When we say that it's not the technology, it's what we do with it, we have a very clear vision of what that means. How do you think about what to do with it? Where do you draw lessons from? And how do you think about the right way, more constructive ways to put technology to use? That's what this book is about, and that's really what we want to talk a little bit about today. I'm going to start off a bit, and then we're going to kick back and forth. Look, real simply, in my experience over 2 decades plus, we've tended to talk about technology as a way to improve schooling, as a way to fix schools, as a way to make education better. My assumption has long been that as soon as you think in those terms, you've already lost the battle. Like I talk about in cage-busting leadership, when you talk about reforming schools or improving schools or fixing schools, basically what you're doing is we're saying we're going to do what we've done, but we're going to do it better. We're going to do more of it. And I don't know anybody who has ever really put technology to work in powerful or transformative ways who has said we're going to do what we've always done, just a little better. Bror and I suggest a very different lens for thinking about how do we put technology to work. And that's the lens of learning science. Rather than talking about making schools better or education better, the question is, how do we identify learning challenges? Opportunities where we can do better by kids, opportunities where we can help teachers use their time in more powerful and more effective ways, opportunity to rethink the organization and the nature of schooling. And as you guys well know, there are lots of examples of this unfolding in fits and starts across the United States today. So it's not that Bror and I are thinking of something that nobody has thought about or nobody is doing. But our contention is that because we don't really have a sense of learning science or what it entails or how to put it to work, that when we look at terrific blended models, when we look at Summit, when we look at Carpe Diem, when we look at Mooresville, when we look at Rocket Ship, when we look at interesting models like Florida Virtual or new classrooms, much of this is trial and error and figuring stuff out on the way. And what Bror and I want to do is give folks some tools and some supports that can help them do that more systematically. Now, it's just important to keep in mind, is the folks in this room I'm not that concerned about. You guys, by and large, get it. But as you know, when you go back to your schools and districts, there's lots of people who read the New York Times or watch 60 Minutes and come in and go, have you heard about Khan? Did you see this thing about Rocket Ship? Have you heard about MOOCs? It's all different now. And it's just useful to remember, as we point out in the book, that it's been all different now about 6 different times in the past century. It was all different now with movie projectors. Thomas Edison said they were going to retire the textbook. It was all different with radio. It was all different with TV. Those of us who are old enough remember school systems spending a lot of money in the 1980s to stick desktops in the back of classrooms. So for the last 15 minutes of typing, we could turn around and journal on computers, which were depreciating rapidly the rest of the day. You remember one-to-one and Enrico back in 2000, or Maine, and how transformative this was all going to be. So when people tell you, look, this stuff is happening finally, tell them to just cool their jets, sit the hell down, and talk to Bror about learning science. Now, the second thing that comes up is you'll get a lot of pushback, particularly my friend Diane Ravitch has said, well, look, Horace Mann had it right in 1837. Nothing done since is actually going to change that schoolhouse. We know what we're doing. There have always been critics. There were critics 200 years ago that worried that paper was going to teach kids to forget how to erase slate boards. There were people a century ago who worried that ballpoint pens would teach kids to be slothful because they would no longer have to worry about reusing pencils. There were people who worried that desktops and laptops were going to make teachers expendable or pointless. The larger challenge, as Bror and I argue in the book, is not that either the enthusiasts have been right or that the critics have been right, but that for all of the money and time and effort and exasperation on the part of teachers and school leaders, hardly a damn thing has changed. We've noted this many times. If you went to sleep in 1913 and woke up in 2013, you would know where to find your classroom, where to find your textbook. You would know what the assessments look like. You would know how to talk to the parents and the principal. It's hard to think of any area of American life, all of these, so much more significant areas like the production of barbecue sauce, where that also holds true. Now, as soon as we start talking about how are we going to change things, we start running into some myths that derive out of what we just talked about.
So, first myth, and a lot of this, you guys are, with us on this, but a lot of folks on the outside write things like technology is anti-teacher, that, you got to choose. What are you for, technology or teachers? But, that's a strange thing to say. Come on, everybody, what are you for, X-rays or doctors? Who's in the MRI camp? Huh? Well, let's get these doctors out of here and get some more technology. What? That's not even a sensible question, right? People will look at you puzzled and say, wait, doctors are the professionals who figure out how to use the new technology to do the next new thing. Well, that's exactly how the profession of teaching ought to be changing, is it's not teachers or technology, it's teachers with technology, right? And it should be an explosion of new career opportunities, just like physicians are completely different animals one from another because of all the other technologies and professionals who work with them. This should be an amazing evolution of the role and interest in being a teacher, and yet we're still having some of these kinds of debates outside this room. Well, another thing people say is, and perhaps that's true in this room, I won't ask for a show of hands, we need more technology. What we're missing is just having more, right? Well, there's a point at which that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, if you really loaded up a room 30 years ago with way more ballpoint pens, how's that doing for your education pieces, right? It's not clear that it's just the technology and more of it that helps you. Richard Clark, a very well-known cognitive scientist at USC, drew an analogy. He said, technology is to learning the way a delivery truck is to nutrition, right? So yeah, better delivery trucks will get you vegetables from the southern hemisphere in the wintertime, and that does help with nutrition, but those same delivery trucks can also get you, high-fatty foods from all over the world, right? So the delivery truck is really valuable, but it is not the same as nutrition. So having more technology, it's not the same as better learning. It's not clear that what we really need is just simply more technology at all.
And Bror, how about people who say, well, okay, but we need to be one-to-one to be able to transform teaching and learning?
Same issue, and we'll talk about this as we go through, that if you haven't actually looked at your learning problem first, simply replicating what you're doing, but with one-to-one computers, you're not getting at your problem. You may be adding confusion to the mix rather than actually a solution. So this is part of what needs to happen, is to think more clearly about the problem. And even this, the next generation, maybe the problem is not that we don't have enough now, but maybe the problem is we just need the next generation. And again, that's not going to be the case either. You think about the evolution of the famous blackboard into the glorious new technology of the smartboard, through the fabulous whiteboard era of mankind, right? And, if you look, unfortunately, no one in this room, but when I've been out visiting schools, you'll often see a smartboard is being used in a very pedestrian way. I mean, teachers for years have been able to Xerox the pages, post them up on whiteboards. They run projectors to show films. And honestly, smartboards are often used exactly the same way. And they cost $3,000, right? Less now. But, this is an expensive way of doing the same thing that was being done before. Now, in fact, you can also do terrific things with test technology, right? Think about it. You're getting visuals to go together with activities. The teacher can have people come up to the board and do things. And, slow me down when we get to series of sliding blackboards. Who's ever had those in there, involved, right? Sliding blackboards, you can do reveals. It's like multimedia using chalk. Come on now, work with me. I don't get out much. Okay, fine. So, it's not the next generation of technology. And I just saw a couple of days ago a note in the New York Times. It turns out that transcutaneous direct stimulation of the brain using little electrodes looks like there may be some evidence it helps learning. And it's true. Nothing will demonstrate to a school superintendent that a classroom is doing well by technology than having every kid wired up with batteries and electrodes, right? I'm dying to see that. No, people, please. Let's not just go do that, right? Let's figure out what the learning problem is and then get busy with that.
All right. So usually this front part takes a little longer when we're talking to folks who aren't already this isn't intuitive to. But you guys get this, right? Technology's a tool. Yeah, okay. I love a room like this. Now, in the book, and this is where we want to get into talking about some of the learning science in particular, but in the book, Bror and I argue that, look, we only know of one learning technology that has systematically and profoundly transformed the nature of teaching and learning. At first, it was met, of course, with great consternation by educators, but it did two profound things that radically altered the nature of teaching and learning. First, it meant that students could no longer just learn from the educators in their school, but that they could learn from experts around the world. And the second thing is it meant that they no longer could just learn at school from their teacher, but could go home and learn and come to school the next day. In essence, it flipped the classroom. What we're talking about, of course, is the book. You all will remember, of course, that this is, those of you who are Lutherans in particular, this will ring a bell, that half a millennia ago, the educators, who of course were generally church employees, shall we say, were deeply concerned that if students were to learn on their own, they were going to learn the wrong things, or they would learn it improperly. But the book did two profound things over time. One, it made it possible for students not just to learn from the teachers who were talking to them, but it made it possible for them to learn from the world's authorities. Abe Lincoln, growing up on the prairie in Illinois, could read the collected works of the Greeks or Shakespeare. And the second thing the book did was it meant that a student could take it home, read, and come back to school the next day, and they could learn even when out of earshot of the teacher, which meant the teacher now had the opportunity to engage the class, to discuss, to debrief. Now, of course, we know that circa 2013, we've all walked into far too many classrooms where kids take the books home and come in, and then they do read-alouds for 50 minutes. Or where the teacher has had the kids read at home and then feels compelled to give the same lecture as a chapter the kids supposedly read the night before. The book in and of itself doesn't solve any of these things. It creates new opportunities for teaching, creates new opportunities for learning, but it can be used well or it can be used poorly. And that's really the intuition here. What Bror and I want folks to do, more than anything else, is understand why the book transformed the work of good teachers in good schools and put that intuition to work every time we're looking at new tools and new technologies. And the people we suggest educators model themselves on are what we call engineers. We say engineers are in the business of identifying problems, considering solutions, and then figuring out how do you put those solutions to work in the real world. This is what architects do when they design a building. It's what educators need to do when they think about learning challenges. They need to think like learning engineers. Bror, how exactly do we do that?
Well, part of it is engineers start from science. They start from something that's really real about the real world. Chemical engineers are deeply invested in chemistry. They want to know what are the scientists finding out. They are not scientists. A chemical engineer has problems at scale that the chemist never has. Look up at the ceiling, I got a really huge pipe. Is that pipe going to break? The guy in the lab never has that problem. He's got little pipes he deals with, but the guy working at scale has to worry about new problems. Well, the same thing is true for education. There ought to be learning engineers who start from how learning actually works and apply that at scale and have a whole new range of problems at scale they have to work from. Now, the kind of learning science that's out there, there's a bunch of different kinds of research about minds and how they work and brains and all this. There's neuroscience work, there's brain science work, there's cognitive science work. Neuroscience and brain science are still at really too early a stage to give engineers working at scale practical new solutions. Neuroscience and brain science have some explanatory power, and maybe in the future they'll say something about what to do next that's new. But right now, the best source of insights for learning engineering is really in the cognitive science world. And so that's a key thing. So what I'm going to do now is, in, maybe 4 minutes, try to give you guys a master's degree in cognitive science. Big breath in. There will be a quiz, because, of course, that helps learning. No, there won't be a quiz. Yeah. So the first thing is that, what expertise actually is has been researched now for decades. And it's actually very interesting when you think about it. When you think about people who are really deep experts, which is kind of the goal of education. Your favorite auto mechanic who, as soon as you pull in, tells you what's wrong with your car. A physician who, as you walk in and you start to describe things, asks a few questions and suddenly narrows in on the key next test to do. What you find is that experts are incredibly fast at doing things compared to normal human beings like Rick and me. Experts are very accurate when they're working in their power zone. They just don't make mistakes. They don't stumble. It just happens well. And if you ever engage an expert in a conversation about a tricky topic in their domain, they do not talk like you and I do. They have a completely different set of fluencies, different set of concepts they use to get this going. So their minds are literally wired up differently. And there's research, and you guys have all heard the term 10,000 hours, right? 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Anders Ericsson did a bunch of work popularized by Malcolm Gladwell that talks about that kind of repeated practice and feedback in a domain as what's required to really get you there. And why does that work? What is it about that sort of work that makes a difference? Because we've got to figure out how to get practice and feedback working correctly for students. Otherwise, they have to do it on their own, which means only a few get there at the end of the day. We should structure this in. The key learning science insight that underpins this expertise is that our minds actually have two different pieces that help us get stuff done as experts or as learners. Working memory is the very narrow part that's verbal, is very flexible but slow, and it's supported by what's called long-term memory. That's the part that comes out of a lot of practice, becomes routine, and what's really cool is it's nonverbal, completely nonverbal. So, quick quiz. Raise your hand. This will check if you're awake. Raise your hand if you drive a car. All right. I tried this in Singapore. It was a disaster. Okay. Okay. So, now, having verified that, raise your hand if the following thing has happened to you. You start out going to place A, and you start thinking about the battles you're having around learning and technology and NACOL or whatever it is you're doing.
Your kids' curfew? Your
kids' curfew. You're struggling on that, and you look up and you realize, I'm at place B, the wrong place. Raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. Look around, people. Look around. And actually, you're not crazy, at least not for that reason, okay? But we all laugh. I usually end up at a Starbucks or something, and I laugh and I go on, right? Who drove you to place B? Who was in charge of a ton of metal moving at 50, 60 miles an hour for who knows how long? When you're on the freeway next, look left, look right, and ask, who's driving those cars? Okay? So cognitive scientists studying experts have found this to be true of all experts. There are these vast sets of non-conscious, complex decisions and routines that no longer require conscious attention. The diagnostician munching the sandwich decides, you got pneumonia plus some other complication with the blood thing, we need these tests. He's not actually, he's thinking about his sandwich. Love pastrami, right? And it's because he's wired in to do this stuff, right? So this is a critical part of this. And around learning and instructional design, therefore, it's hard to get experts to describe their expertise because so much of it is nonverbal, right? So that's a problem, and that we've got to do more to unearth it. We've also got to give enough practice to build those nonverbal, deep, long-term memory competencies, whether it's for reading or writing or early math and all the way up. New learning builds on the masteries that are already fluent. So we've got to spend more time thinking deeply about that.
So next time you watch Karate Kid, all of that Miyagian stuff that he's doing on, it's all about working through working memory, getting it into long-term memory so that he can actually start to process stuff. Because remember, working memory, you've only got so many windows. It's like when you make your laptop crash. Thing is, you've got to actually help kids master these modules, whether conceptual, content-based, or skill-based, so that they can actually move on to the next challenge.
Exactly, exactly. So, well, you notice I didn't say a word about technology here, right? This is about the brain. And now the cool thing is, brains have been about the same for 50,000 to 250,000 years, depending on which, evolutionary neurobiologist you talk to, right? Our brains do not change at the rate of Moore's law. They change fast compared to glaciers, okay? So the key when you're looking at technology is to realize the mind's learning machinery is the same. So you want to know what's the problem with the environment for learning, and then as technology changes, how can we make good use of that, right? So what does technology offer here? It's a delivery truck. Does that mean it's irrelevant? No, it's incredibly important when you get it into the right place in the diagnostics of being an engineer and doing problem solving. The key thing is it gets you 5 really important things once you've identified a good learning solution. It makes a good learning solution more affordable in terms of variable costs of delivery. It makes it more reliable. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't wake up hungover. It doesn't get grumpy about its kids, usually. It's technology, right? It's available 24/7, right? Doesn't need a sleep break or a nap. It can be personalizable, which is very cool to take into account what are the fluencies of this mind, and therefore slow down or speed up. And finally, it's data rich, which means suddenly you can create feedback loops to improve it in a way that just has never been done before. So technologies do this, but remember, they'll do it for bad learning solutions. Take a second, imagine your worst ever college professor available to 1 million students in Kazakhstan. We are learning with technology now. Yes? Win for tech? No. That guy used to only damage a few thousand kids a year, right? He's become a weapon of mass destruction in the education arena, right? So the technology, it's in the hands of the user, right? So you got to figure out what your learning solution is before you start applying technology. It has critical things that it can do for you. Another example here of a fabulous learning approach that's been around forever is, of course, the Socratic method. And it is true, Socrates never administered a single standardized test. If you think about this, think how great it is, right? It's personalized, right? It's just listening and coming back and forth to you. It's adaptive, it mixes up where you are, what you're doing, and all that. It's also very much about producing. It's active. You cannot be passive in a real Socratic engagement back and forth, right? And it's all about the practice and feedback. You are running your neurons at a frantic pace, right? This is fabulous. But it's almost impossible to do at scale and affordably. Now, there are some folks who are having a go at it. I mean, for example, the Houston public school system, the Apollo 20 program has very much gone in for tutoring and trying to get this to work with small groups of students. Wow, is it expensive. It ends up being, $1,000 a student when you add up the investment they're making. It's a fabulous learning environment, but geez, is it expensive. And it's not just that. There's a lot of turnover among the hundreds of tutors, so you have an HR exercise that's really hard. Can technology help? Well, it turns out we're on the edge of it really being able to do that. There's a learning scientist at Arizona State University named Kurt Van Lane. And in our book, we describe how he did a meta-analysis of the last 12 years of automated tutoring systems, intelligent tutoring systems. And he was able to show that the best of these, I don't know, half of them, actually get close to average human tutoring intervention capabilities. Now, none of the technology gets anywhere close to the best tutors, right? Socrates, he doesn't have to worry about, well, he's not, yeah. So, okay, so he doesn't have to worry, whoever is the equivalent Socrates, right? But we're talking mass. We're talking large numbers of people, not the ones who have access to a modern Socrates, right? And so, but then why would I be excited? It's only as good as the average tutor, so what's the point? The point is all those other things: affordable, reliable, available, data-rich, personalizable, zero variable cost of delivery. Why aren't there more of these out there, right? That's great technology tied into learning science, get it targeted against a problem, off we go. They've ended up mostly being laboratory experiments. And that's a mistake. This is the kind of thing that can really transform how learning works.
And you know, Bror, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind, especially when you go back, I've talked in Cage Busting Leadership about trying to think real discreetly about how do you use dollars and minutes in your school. Go back and look, how many minutes does a typical student get of deliberate practice where they see the, expertise modeled, get to try it, get real-time feedback, iterate, right? It's the kind of stuff that Dreambox does.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of stuff, in my experience, that your typical student, even in a really good school, maybe gets 15, 20 minutes of this a day on a good day. And one of the things Bror's talking about is in Apollo 20, you've got these tutors are working with 16 kids a day, 2 kids at a time for an hour at a pop. That gets those kids an extra 30 or 60 minutes of this kind of support. But what Van Lane's talking about is being able to do this essentially as much as we need.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are, who are quant heads, the standard deviation on the support of a human tutor, Van Lane finds, is about 0.75. Average computer-assisted tutoring is about 0.36 standard deviations, but the best of them come in at about 0.7. Yeah. So they get you about 90% of the impact of your typical human one-on-one tutor.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an opportunity that we should be investing in. They're expensive up front, of course. That's the problem. But it's the Industrial Revolution finally arriving in education, right? More investment up front, leading to higher quality and lower actual unit delivery costs. The opportunity is right there to do it if we do this as a learning engineering exercise, right? And that's what getting technology right is about. And our best learning leaders now, whether they're using technologies or not, are aware of this. This is a quote from John Danner, but you could talk to Mark Edwards, you could talk to the folks at Summit, you could talk to the Carpe Diem folks, and they'll all say the same thing. And Rick in the book, interviewed many of these to chat with them about this, and they all say the same thing, that when media come to talk to us, they ask us about the technology. They've asked us exactly the wrong question. It's never been about the technology. We designed the learning environment to match the learning problems of our kids, and in some cases, like John Danner, he did it paper and pencil first. And it was only later that he then used technology to make it affordable, reliable, available, data-rich. Pretty soon we'll all be singing this, right? And that's exactly the right way to think about it. And that's exactly what we need to do more of, is diagnose the learning problem first, figure out where it is. Is it in the structure of the instructional design? Is it in motivation? Is it in something about planning and scheduling for the student? And then have good learning solutions for whatever the problem is, and then go find technologies, right? That's the engineering approach that we're really advocating in the book.
All right. In the book, what we tried to do is offer both a primer in all of this. Also, talking about things like the complementary roles of audio and visual, and how bad technology can actually undermine learning, especially, say, PowerPoint presentations. Thanks. But also, what are the design predicates on using technology in ways that support and accelerate student learning and mastery? So, in addition to hoping that you all take a look at the book and get out of there, we've also tried to point to a whole bunch of additional resources. One of the key things to keep in mind is that generally teacher prep and principal prep, even cutting edge, even new model programs for school leaders and superintendents and teachers, have generally done an abysmal job of introducing folks to cognitive science. It's not part of even kind of the non-traditional preparation programs. It's almost entirely absent in the traditional programs. So what's frustrating, I think, is educators say this is interesting as we've spoken to them, but they go, why are you blaming me? I don't know this. And I think that's where we need to get out of this mindset of blame. Look, it's not educators' fault if they haven't learned this stuff because nobody's taught it to them. But we do need to start thinking differently about training, preparation, and PD if we want people to be able to think like learning engineers. But in addition to that, there are a couple other places where we get stuck, where we want to get this stuff right and we run into trouble. So let's just touch on those. We talk about them at more length in the book. The first, of course, is stuff that's, eminently familiar to anybody in the iNACOL orbit, is the ways in which rules and regulations and contracts and policies written for the world of the horseman schoolhouse don't lend themselves to letting folks solve problems, deploy new technology. This is the permissible use of textbook allocation funds, the problem with using Title I for learning technologies which are going to be accessible to all students is a violation of supplement, not supplant. Concerns about teacher of record requirements when you're dealing with virtual instruction. Seat time, you know the deal. Two thoughts here. First, and this again is stuff I talked about at length in cage busting leadership, is when I talk to folks on the other side of the table, folks in Washington at 400 Maryland, folks in the state education agencies, folks at the district, I will talk to school leaders or to teachers or to folks trying to solve problems who will say, those lunkheads won't work with us. And then I will talk with those lunkheads, and they'll tell me those lunkheads in the schools had never asked us how to help solve it. So the first order of business is when you're running into these frustrations, be clear about the learning problem you want to solve, be clear about what you need to do to solve that problem more effectively, be clear about what change in rule or statute or regulation or contract will enable you to solve that without having to spend more money. And I will first off suggest that you're going to find a much more receptive audience than folks have often thought they would get or seem to get when they approach it in other ways. The second thing is if they say, I don't think that's going to work, ask them, all right, how do we make it work? If they say, I can't do that, tell them, all right, but could you please show me in black and white the prohibition on this reallocation of funds? Because one of the great truths is that we have a penumbra of gutlessness that envelops much of what we call ed reform. It's not that it's impossible to reallocate Title I dollars because of supplement, not supplant, and maintenance of effort. It's that it's a real pain in the butt for your district Title I coordinator. It's that your state education agency folks who do Title I have been trained by consultants hired by the federal government, and what they're all most concerned about is avoiding auditing exceptions. So they will tell you out of convenience that you cannot do things when what they are doing is politely termed lying. You can do these things, but it requires pushing and being creative and inviting them to the table to help you figure out how to do it. Second big obstacle we run into is, in particular, teacher unions have raised concerns about a lot of these changes. For some of the concerns about how technology is anti-teacher, but also because of discomfort with change. It's natural to all of us. And every field has seen employees whose jobs are going to be changed or altered by technology. It's not in any way unique to teachers. We know, for instance, what happened in Idaho, and particularly the union's role in pushing back on those reforms a couple years back. One key thing to do is to distinguish the union from how teachers feel about this stuff. The union's job is to protect its members, their benefits, their jobs, their sense of professional self-esteem. So you have to work with unions as you have to work with them and find negotiated settlements. But with teachers, my experience, and I think Bror's too, is teachers are actually much less dead set on being concerned about technology, but they have lived through many generations of crap being shoveled at them. Mm-hmm. They have been sold things that they have had to get trained for, which didn't make a difference for kids, things which didn't work in the classroom, things which were around for 18 months and then got replaced by something else, and they had to waste time learning it and transferring, records onto it. Teachers are more than anything else exasperated with sleazebags and snake oil salesmen. So part of the question is if we want them at the table working with this stuff, using it, being excited about it, and embracing it like professionals, is we've got to treat them with that same respect, and we've got to think about these solutions with that same eye to how do these things work in schools. Third concern, which we'll hear time after time, is, look, we've got to be careful about how we do rollout. We're worried about personal devices because kids might access impermissible websites on school grounds. Kids are going to use them to harass or bully, and the schools are going to be liable. Now, let's keep in mind that this is true of every technology. We've never seemed inclined to ban paper and pencil because kids could write hostile notes or lewd comments. Instead, we understood that kids are citizens in the world. They're going to be using pens and paper their whole lives, and we need to teach them how to use these things responsibly. And I think that's the same mindset that we want to bring to using new technologies. And in particular, when you look at places like Riverside, or when you talk to Lenny Shad in Houston, what they'll tell you is concerns about wastage and breakage and loss are real and legitimate, and we have to put in place policies which hold children responsible. But they also find that their breakage with devices is maybe a fifth of what it used to be in terms of textbooks, because kids value these things and use them and treat them with a respect that they generally don't regard for textbooks. Look, final point, and then we can take a couple Twitter questions, I think, and then we'll wrap it. Final point here is that oftentimes reform feels like it's something done to educators. Whether it's accountability, whether it's teacher evaluation, whether it's technology, you'll talk to teachers and school leaders and even superintendents who feel like this is something being done to them by policymakers and advocates. And the reality is that's partly because the folks driving this train have learned to distrust educators in the field. They feel like educators are naysayers. They feel like educators are making excuses. And personally, I think there's more than a grain of truth to that. How do you turn that around? You turn that around not by complaining about it, not by questioning the motives of policymakers or advocates, but by identifying learning problems, being honest about where we're not doing right by kids, coming up with smart solutions, and championing those solutions. And I think what you'll find, and I don't need to tell folks in this room that, but I think what your colleagues will find as you go home and talk to them is that if that's the mindset they bring, they're going to understand why folks like Mark Edwards and Diane Tavner and John Danner don't feel like victims, but feel very much like they're riding in the engine alongside the foundations and the policymakers. Because when you're solving problems and when you're putting learning science to work, the policymakers and advocates and funders want to hear from you because they're looking for people who know what the heck they're doing. Thank you so much for letting us be with you today. I think we have time for a couple quick questions.
We are actually out of time and
sorry about that.
But Bror and Rick will be after their book signing at the last session outside for the Meet the Experts. So there'll be time for a outside campfire, town hall type chat. So personalizable, right? Personalizable, affordable, reliable, available, data rich.
Yep.
Love it.
That's it.
Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.
Well done, sir. Nicely done.
And we'll release you. We only have 15 minutes between the sessions, so we'll do the book signing. And thank you, and we'll enjoy the rest of your time here. This is our last time together, so thank you.